February 27th is called to order. Representative Ryan, can I have a motion to approve the minutes for February 20th?
Thank you.
Move approval of the minutes for February 20th.
Representative Ryan moves approval of the minutes for February 20th. Any discussions? Hearing none, those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The motion prevails. The minutes for February 27th are approved. Members, last Wednesday's agenda has been moved to today, and so on the agenda today, we have two bills. The first up is House File 463 with Representative Vang, and then after that, we're gonna have House File 24 with Representative Jordan, and the second half of the committee will be a presentation from the Office of the Legislative Auditor on the State Sustainable Building Guidelines. I move House File 463 with a recommendation that is referred to Ways and Means. Representative Vang, to your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. I have a bill on House File 463 regarding the Rural Finance Authority, which is the state Maine's agriculture lending arm. Although the RFA has legal authority to issue loans directly, it typically partners with private agricultural lenders to provide favorable financing opportunities for eligible farmers. This bill will borrow $50 million from the bond market and appropriate the proceeds to the Rural Finance Authority to purchase participating interests in loans issued by private lenders or to make direct loans to farmers under RFA's beginning farmer, loan restructuring, seller-sponsored agriculture improvement, and livestock inspection loan programs. These bonds are user-financed and provide low-interest loans to farmers. It has a strong record of success and minimal default on the loans. And with that, Mr. Chair, that is my bill.
Thank you, Representative Vang. I have here that you have two testifiers. The first one is Mac McDevitt from MDA.
Yes.
Welcome. Please identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Hello, I am Matt McDevitt, Mr. Chair and members, and I'm the Ag Finance Supervisor for the Rural Finance Authority. I'm up here today just to answer any questions. Loan volume's been brisk this year, just the beginning farmer loan. I think we're around 70 applications just for the fiscal year. So things have been moving along this year. A lot of interest and a lot of land purchases out there for young farmers.
Thank you for that. The next up, we have Director Lori from the Minnesota Farmers Union. Welcome. Please identify yourself and proceed.
Thank you, Chair Lee, and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Stu Laurie. I'm the Government Relations Director for Minnesota Farmers Union. We're a grassroots general farm organization and eager to share our strongest support for Representative Vang's bill to replenish the Rural Finance Authority. Our members are diverse. We have members raising vegetables in hoop houses over to folks raising conventional row crops on many more acres. But what unites them all is that access to financing is a central challenge. The RFA is really a jewel of our Department of Agriculture in helping farmers access the credit that they need. And so we strongly support this. I'll also highlight, as I did in our letter to the committee, that there's precedent for passing funding for the RFA ahead of a full bonding package. It's a different kind of bond, as you well know, and in 2017 and again in 2020, the state moved early to provide certainty to farmers by replenishing the RFA ahead of a funding lapse. So I appreciate the opportunity to share our support, and thank you so much.
Thank you. So we don't have any others public testifiers signed up. Members, do we have any questions for Representative Vang? Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Vang, do you know if the default rate has changed in recent years, given the expansion of eligibility for some loans?
I think Matt McDevitt would be best suited for this question.
Mr. McDevitt.
Mr. Chair.
Chair members, Matt McDevitt, Ag Finance Supervisor, Rural Finance Authority. Default rates tend to be about one every 3 years, so it really hasn't changed much recently. Current rate is 0.0002%, and we do have a loan loss reserve to cover of a little over $2 million to cover losses that we do incur in the future.
Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That answers my question.
Members, any further discussion? Representative Grasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess one more question would be, what is the alternative if there are no bond funds authorized for these loan types?
Mr. McDevitt.
Okay, Mr. Chair, members, the Rural Finance Authority can go out and sell bonds on our own. However, we're not going to be rated nearly as high as the state of Minnesota, hence making our funds considerably more expensive and less of an incentive for Minnesota farmers to use it.
Further discussion? Hearing none, I renew my motion that House File 463 is recommended to be re-referred to the Ways and Means Committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The motion prevails and House File 463 is re-referred to the Ways and Means Committee.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda is House File 24. Representative Jordan Lesser is line removal. And I will move House File 24 to get it before the committee with a recommendation that is laid over. Representative Jordan, you have the House File, the 24A6 amendment. It's an author's amendment, so I'll move the A6 amendment for Representative Jordan. Representative Jordan, can you explain the amendment briefly?
Yes, Mr. Chair. The A6 amendment was drafted in consultation with the state government, with PFA and stakeholders. So in the event of a surplus in mapping money, which is a provision of the bill, this language would roll any surplus into the cost of actually then replacing the lead service lines. It also changes the work plan requirements for water providers servicing 15,000 service connections. And then finally, the A6 clarifies the appropriation and includes cleanup language. Mr. Chair, I believe the bill is being laid over, and so there might still be some additional work to just make sure that we can account for every possible drop of federal funding. I ask for member support.
Thank you, Representative Jordan. So I move House File 24, the A6 amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The motion prevailed. The A6 amendment is adopted. Members, we do have the A4 amendment. That's the chair's amendment. I will not be offering it today. Working with Chair or Representative Jordan to see if we can find some language to really identify disadvantaged communities. And so at this time, we'll not be offering the A4 amendment. And so, Representative Jordan, to your bill as amended.
Thank you, Chair Lee. Thank you, members of the committee. I'm excited to present House File 24, which is a bill to protect Minnesotans from exposure to lead in their drinking water through their lead service lines. Members, this is fundamentally a bill to protect Minnesotans from exposure to lead. And since this is a new committee, I will remind us that if there's one takeaway we take away from this committee today, it is that no amount of exposure to lead is safe. And lead service lines are one of the largest sources of lead in Minnesota's drinking water. And often, almost always in fact, lead service lines are both publicly and privately owned. Both parts of the line must be replaced simultaneously to avoid increasing lead concentration in drinking water. Lead exposure through drinking water is truly a statewide issue. These lead service lines are present across Minnesota in all communities, urban, suburban, and rural. Lead exposure through service lines is also most common in lower income communities where the housing stock tends to be older. Many cities and townships do not have a comprehensive map of lead lines. This bill is critical not only for the health and safety of our constituents and their drinking water, but we also need to pass this bill now to maximize the federal funding provided by the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed in 2021 by Congress, and to provide the assistance Minnesota communities need to be in compliance with the federal law as it relates to mapping of lead service lines. And here's what House File 24 does. It establishes the eligible recipients and uses of the grants to replace lead service lines. Recipients could be any of the following: community public water suppliers of a community water system, so that's your typical water supply like the city of St. Cloud. Municipalities, suppliers of other residential drinking water systems, and any applicant that is eligible for loans and grants under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. Eligible uses include the replacement, construction costs, communication costs that cities or municipalities could incur saying, hey, we're gonna be in your neighborhood, please give us access to your property, or sending out postcards asking for public comment, et cetera. And also repaying any debt that these service providers use that they have accrued for the above uses. Grant money can be used to pay for 100% of the cost of replacing privately owned lead lines, and only 50% of those lead lines that are publicly owned. It promotes planning. The planning says that a plan needs to include how the recipient, so again the municipality or the water supplier, will maximize the number of participating property owners, with portions of lead water lines that are privately owned, including low-income or disadvantaged communities. how the recipient will maximize efficient use of funds by coordinating the replacement of the publicly and privately owned portions, how the recipient will minimize partial replacement, and how equity for disadvantaged groups is prioritized in the plan. Further, this bill requires that grant applicants have at least 15,000 water connections. So that's, if you think about it, a connector probably around the same size of the city of Eagan or St. Cloud or higher. And again, it's the water connections. Must submit a workforce plan as part of their application that describes how the applicant will maximize the use of registered apprentices and workers from communities that are underrepresented in the construction and building trades industry. Like all government projects, there is a prevailing wage provision. It also requires a report from PFA, the Public Facilities Authority. Sorry, I should have clarified that acronym for folks. A report from PFA to the legislature on how the grant is going. There's also Section 3 is really the mapping grants, and make sure you're looking at how that is modified by the A6 amendment. And with that, Mr. Chair, I think we should proceed to testimony and discussion.
Thank you, Representative Jordan. First up, we have a remote testimony from Mayor Droba from International Falls. Welcome, Mr. Mayor. Please identify yourself and proceed.
Thank you, Chair Lee, for allowing me to testify today in favor of House File 24. Again, my name is Harley Droba, Mayor of International Falls. I'm here on behalf of my city and the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities. International Falls is a city with about 5,800 people right along the border of Canada, about 300 miles north of you, and we can see Canada from right where I'm at. The Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities is an advocacy organization with more than 110 cities throughout the state outside the 7-county metro. Cities like mine are at the forefront of ensuring that citizens have clean water, and that includes us keeping the lead out of the drinking water. I'm here to emphasize that this is a statewide issue, and lead is a problem that we're all dealing with, not just in the metro or big cities like Duluth. Lead pipes and fixtures in homes is a concern throughout our state. The Minnesota Department of Health has stated that homes built before 1940 have lead service lines that connect them to public water. The plumbing systems built before 1986 may have lead parts, and that describes a lot of the housing in Greater Minnesota. International Falls specifically has 2,700 water customers, and based on the early data collected as part of our lead service line inventory, we expect that nearly 1,000 of our 2,700 customers would have lead somewhere in their service line. Because of the lead lines are found in older homes, the individuals that are affected are more likely to be low or moderate income homes and cannot afford expensive line service replacement. That's why we're really excited about having legislation that will help map and identify where these lead connections are, as well as having some funding to help replace them. This bill will help homeowners and cities remove the lead lines once they're identified. It's important because typically the houses with the lead lines and fixtures are not usually able to afford the replacements. That's why the reason we strongly support putting money into these issues. On average, incomes in Greater Minnesota are lower than you would see in the metro area. The median home income for Greater Minnesota is $53,086 compared to $93,659 in the metropolitan area. That means that they're more likely to be affected in Greater Minnesota than and people would have a harder time paying for these repairs. The one final thing that I want to point out is that in replacing these lines, the easiest and least expensive way to do it is to combine it with other infrastructure projects, such as street improvements. But if we combine lead replacement with other projects, we can get more lead pipes replaced for the same amount of money. International Falls, over the last couple of years, has been working hard to establish a capital improvement plan to identify all the needs in our system and implement projects in a cost-effective manner. We have identified lead service lines, an aging water treatment plant, aging lift stations, and I&I resulting from failing mains and laterals as major needs to our community. To keep affordable services in mind, all of the system needs need to be brought together so that we can do funding projects and put all of these needs together. So as the legislature looks on how to prioritize this funding, we would like you to keep this idea in mind of utilizing more projects to be able to do the lead lines, I&I, or any other things with street repairs and such. In conclusion, we think that the lead pipe issue needs to be addressed across the state, both in the metro and greater Minnesota area. We support the bill such as this one to take on an important step in the lead replacement. Thank you. If you have any questions, I stand by.
Thank you, Mayor. Next on the agenda, we have John Thorson with LiUNA, Minnesota and North Dakota. Welcome, please identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, my name is John Thorson. I'm Legislative Director for LiUNA, Minnesota and North Dakota. We're Minnesota's infrastructure union representing more than 13,000 skilled construction laborers who build and maintain our roads, highways, bridges, and the basic utilities that allow our communities to thrive. We're proud to stand with the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities, Conservation Minnesota, the Operating Engineers Local 49, the St. Paul Regional Water Services, and the Associated General Contractors in seeking a transformational investment in our state's future that puts us on a path to remove what the Minnesota Department of Health estimates to be over 100,000 lead service lines in communities throughout our entire state. We strongly support the provisions of House File 24 that call for eliminating all lead service lines by 2033 and provide the funding necessary to ensure cities can map, identify, and replace lead pipes, both in the public right-of-way and the 70% of service lines on private property. So who's most at risk? Minnesotans living in older homes, especially those constructed before 1945 are at greater risk of having a lead service line. Historically, lead was used because it's less expensive than iron, could more easily be bent around existing structures without leaking, and allowed more durable connections to stiffer pipes that expand and contract with temperature. LiUNA members are skilled in lead service line replacement and have worked with cities all throughout the nation to accelerate the identification and removal of lead pipes in urban, rural, and suburban communities. Here in Minnesota, it's estimated that removal and replacement of lead service pipes will create and maintain around 2,400 jobs annually over the next 10 years. We're very excited about the career and economic inclusion opportunities this brings to Minnesota's construction industry through registered union apprenticeships that increase participation of women, people of color, veterans, and others not yet participating in our economy to their fullest. Mr. Chair, I want to thank Representative Jordan for bringing this proposal forward and encourage members of this committee to support House File 24 and these critical state investments to ensure that lead pipes are replaced and clean drinking water is delivered to families and children across Minnesota. This is an investment that will increase the health, social, and economic vitality of our entire state. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Thorson. Next on the agenda, we have Stefan Witherspoon, a community advocate from Duluth, who is testifying remotely. Welcome, please identify yourself and proceed.
Hello, yes, my name is Stefan Witherspoon. I am a local activist here and have worked with Minnesota Environmental Partnership on many projects in the past 6-7 years. I was once a community health coordinator for Myers Wilkins, a elementary school here in Duluth, Minnesota. Just a personal story. When I was working there, I helped families get housing, food, and some health care help, through our services. And there was an instance where I worked with this young boy who, they claimed who had ADHD, but with MEP, when we did some local testing with like 10 or 15 homes within the area where I worked, all the homes had very high levels of lead in their homes. And upon that testing, I did ask for these kids who live in these homes get tested. This young boy was tested and he was diagnosed with ADHD, so he was kind of bouncing off the walls every day and walking out of class. But when they tried to help his ADHD and they give him medicine, I remember he was sitting in the hall with his eyes wide open, with his mouth wide open, and he looked like a zombie, and it looked like he was like literally in a coma, and it really affected me. And so I had to call the superintendent and other people within that realm. When they tested him for lead again, and they treated the lead poisoning, he got better over time, and it was not ADHD. This bill, House 24, will be what the loop needs to fully replace the lead service lines in our community, and it promises to replace these lines at no cost to the homeowner or landlord. Thanks to this bill, all the lead lines will be replaced in 10 years. This means we're preventing a whole new generation of kids experiencing lead damage. This really is about environmental justice, and we hope that you guys will help to passing this bill. And in your package, you will see with MEP 20 other organizations who signed on to this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Witherspoon. Members, that ends our public testimony. Any questions or discussion for Representative Jordan? Representative Fogelman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Rep. Jordan. Can you tell me if this covers anybody living like on an acreage?
Representative Jordan.
Mr. Chair, Representative Fogelman, this would cover anyone who is like serviced by a municipal like water system or one of the services don't go directly to residents, they go to the water suppliers themselves. So it could be the municipalities, I just had that list and I lost it, but there's a number of, the recipients of the grants are not individual property owners, they're municipalities or water service providers, or anyone who is eligible for that funding under other state programs.
Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair. Why did I do that?
Happy Monday.
The very masculine chair. I'd just like to ask, and Representative Jordan, maybe this isn't for you, maybe it's more for the chair, but can you explain how this differs from what we include in the bonding bill language that we had before? How is this different?
Thank you, Representative Erdahl. So the language that we have in the bonding bill that's moving right now was language that Representative Jordan carried last year. And since that time, it has evolved into House File 24. But the agreement last year that we had with the GOP caucuses in the House and the Senate was that language. And so in order to keep our commitment to what we have discussed last year for a bonding bill, that's why that language was included in the proposal that's moving forward. Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And certainly, this is an important issue. We need to make sure that people are drinking safe water in the state of Minnesota. But I know that the Public Facilities Authority had some questions and concerns with what was being worked on last year. And I guess I'd like to hear from Mr. Freeman as to his feelings on the current legislation.
Director
He's
Freeman.
here, Mr. Chair.
Welcome, Director Freeman. Please identify yourself and proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Jeff Freeman. I'm the Executive Director of the Public Facilities Authority.
Representative Erdahl, do you have a specific question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Director Freeman, if you could, we've had conversations in the past. I'm just wondering, does this current bill meet the needs and expectations of PFA?
Director Freeman.
Mr. Chair, Representative Erdahl, I want to thank Representative Jordan for this important bill, and she has been very willing to work with us on some changes, and we're still working on some language. What we want to really do is make sure that we can fully utilize the federal funding that's on the way for lead service line replacement. Minnesota's on track to receive about $43 million a year for 5 years, so over $200 million for lead service line replacement. That's a mix of grant and loan funds. And then the state funding that's in Representative Jordan's bill will allow us to fill in some of the gaps and extend the impact of those federal funds, and that we're working on language to make sure that the federal and the state money work together in the most efficient way.
Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so I guess I should know, is this bill traveling separately? Is this going to be included in the bonding bill?
Representative Erdahl, right now, the plan is to lay over House File 24 until we have further budget discussions on where this will be, quite possibly traveling alone.
Okay.
Representative Erdahl.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that answers my next question. Yeah, I was wondering where these changes that you are still contemplating, Director Freeman, would be made, and there'll be time to make them, and apparently there will be time as this is put together to still include those. So thank you, Representative Jordan, for working on this, and Director Freeman, and look forward to the final result.
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Director Freeman. Listening to the testimony from International Falls where the comparison was made between greater Minnesota communities and the average metropolitan across the whole metro area, it seems we have the same problem we have with wastewater, and that is that poor metro communities would not qualify because they are part of an average, higher average metropolitan area. So then the dollars go to greater Minnesota first, or even poorer communities within larger cities because of averages across the city. So how do you balance that if we are looking at overall metropolitan averages?
Director Freeman.
Mr. Chair, Representative Hansen, that's the lead service line issue is a little different in terms of the fact that, or one of the big differences is that in most cities, a portion of that service line is privately owned by the property owner, and then a portion publicly owned by the city. So the typical city user charges and revenues that are available to pay for municipal improvements cannot be used on the private side. So part of what we've been doing is structuring our funding, first of all, through the federal funding and the federal process to make sure that the grant portion of the federal funds is directed to the privately owned portion of the lead service lines. And we've used the state affordability criteria and looked at what's the impact to individual households by doing that. And we believe that it is appropriate and possible to use those federal funds to meet that private need, the private costs to the property owner to replace these lines where there's no cost to the property owner. And we'll be able to do that in all cities throughout the state. That's our intention, that's our plan. The loan portion of the federal funds, we have to make those loans. The EPA won't give us just the grant money without also taking the federal portion. So we are working on a plan where we can use those loan funds to make a loan to the municipalities for work on the public side. And this language, or in the House File 24, will appropriate state funds that can essentially come along and then help to repay those loans in addition to doing additional work, accelerated work. So in the end, our strong goal is to make sure that this work gets done across the state in all communities at no cost to the property owner or to the municipality. We want to make sure that that cost is not an obstacle to getting this work done. We want to do it as quickly as possible. It'll take time, but we want cities and projects to move as quickly as possible.
Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. But if you're using affordability criteria and it's not explicit in the IUP, you have the discretion on where the dollars go, and the dollars would go to the lower average income compared to the higher average across the metropolitan area. Is that correct?
Director Freeman.
Mr. Chair, Representative Hanson, so all of the health department is modifying their priority system rules to where all projects for lead service line replacement will rank in what we call the fundable range on our list. So our plan is that every city that applies for funds that has projects ready to go will be able to access these funds. We'll work with cities and the available funding to make sure that funding is within each city, that cities prioritize their areas based on health equity factors as well as cost efficiencies. The mayor mentioned the efficiency of tying this work together with water main replacement projects, for example. And so all cities will be required to look at those considerations. The health department is developing a health equity tool, a computerized tool that will break down various criteria matrices across the city by census tract and be able to help that city target and prioritize funding based on health equity, also based on cost efficiency. That's part of what the health department will be doing as projects, proposals come into the project priority list process and then move to the intended use plan.
Representative Hanson.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So Director Freeman, that would be then with the agency's discretion, there's not any statutory guidance for that.
Director Freeman.
Mr. Chair, Representative Hanson, this is the health department's process for identifying health priorities. The details of it, I probably want to defer to them, and maybe we can have a meeting to talk about more specifically how that will work.
Members, any additional questions for Representative Jordan? Representative Grasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess for Representative Jordan, as far as these funds go, will they be distributed equally between greater Minnesota and the metro area?
Representative Jordan.
Mr. Chair, Representative Grossell, that is kind of what we were just discussing about the prioritization. They will be distributed to municipalities that have lead service lines in the manner that Director Freeman just outlined.
Representative Grasso. Members, any additional questions? Representative Scriba.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Being the mayor of Ely, I've used PFA, I've used your services. And hearing your testimony today, I understand, and Representative Hanson trying to statutorily or I think there is that gray area where the statutes say you should do this, but we also know that, and I think what Representative Jordan said, if there's a community that has a high lead content and they have a high income, I personally don't care. Fix the lead problem. To me, that, and I think that's what the agencies do. I think they look at it that way first, and then they go to the statute, and then they go to the, if there's everyone competing for it equally, I'm hoping that everyone gets a fair shake out of this, and that Greater Minnesota gets looked at as a metro based on what are the needs of the communities or how bad is the lead. And from what I've heard, that's kind of what I'm going to bed knowing that it's being done fairly. But thank you, Mr. Chair.
Members, any additional question? Seeing none, thank you, Representative Jordan. House File 24 is laid over. As amended. Next up is the Office of the Legislative Auditor, who will be reporting on the Sustainable Building Guidelines. Members, please seek recognition for question and we will get your name added to the list. Well, welcome to the committee, Auditor Randall. Please identify yourself and proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Judy Randall. I'm the Legislative Auditor. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss our evaluation of sustainable building guidelines. As you may know, state law requires all new buildings and major renovations that receive general obligation bond proceeds to follow the state sustainable building guidelines. The guidelines address various sustainability elements such as air quality, lighting, and energy efficiency standards. However, we found that for really a variety of reasons, there is little oversight of the program. There is no state agency that ensures all building projects comply with the guidelines as required, and there are no consequences if building projects do not comply with the guidelines. In fact, there's not even an agreed-upon list of which building projects are subject to the guidelines. Perhaps then, not surprisingly, due to limitations with program data, the costs and outcomes associated with implementing the sustainable building guidelines are unknown. In short, this is a program for which no state agency is in charge and no one is held accountable. We think the legislature has an important role here. If the legislature wants to continue requiring that certain buildings comply with the sustainable building guidelines, we recommend that the legislature clarify the law, identify which agency is in charge of this program, and then take proactive steps to ensure that building projects subject to the guidelines are held accountable. It's a big lift, not gonna lie. But to get more into the details of our findings and recommendations, I would like to now turn to Ms. Caitlin Badger, who is the manager for our evaluation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Badger, please identify yourself and proceed.
Chair Lee, members, I want to thank you for having us here today. For the record, my name is Caitlin Badger. I'm with the Office of the Legislative Auditor, and I was the manager for this report. Before we get going, I would like to thank my colleagues on this evaluation, Will Harris and Kyle Malone, both of whom are with us here today. I'd also like to thank staff from the Department of Administration, the Department of Commerce, and the Center for Sustainable Building Research for their assistance throughout our evaluation. So I'll start by providing a quick roadmap of my comments here today. I'll first highlight our key findings that we're going to talk about before I provide a brief program overview. I'll then dig more into our findings and recommendations in greater detail, first regarding program roles and responsibilities, before discussing the extent to which projects have complied with the guidelines. I'll then touch briefly on program goals before wrapping up with a brief discussion about program outcomes of the Sustainable Building Guidelines. I will note that throughout this presentation, you'll see a number of photos that are actually projects subject to the Sustainable Building Guidelines, which will give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the projects we're talking about here today. So first, our key findings. We found that there was a lack of clarity pertaining to the roles and responsibilities of the various entities involved with the Sustainable Building Guidelines, and that lack of clarity has led to a program with limited oversight and limited accountability. Further, we found that the extent to which projects have complied with the Sustainable Building Guidelines is currently unknown, and that the program lacks clear objectives and goals. Finally, we found that the outcomes of the Sustainable Building Guidelines are also unknown, both with regard to the cost of the program and how it's affected the cost of bond-funded buildings, as well as the overall sustainability of those buildings. So let's first start out by briefly reviewing what are the Sustainable Building Guidelines. According to the Sustainable Building Guidelines, the guidelines aim to reduce energy consumption, enhance the health and well-being of building occupants, and improve the quality of the environment. By law, the Sustainable Building Guidelines are required for certain capital construction projects. Specifically, state law requires all new buildings and I'll quote major renovations that are fully or partially funded with general obligation bond proceeds to follow the Sustainable Building Guidelines. So this would include projects that are run or overseen by state agencies, as well as those run or overseen by local government units. In accordance with state statutes, the guidelines must include several different sustainability elements. So for instance, the guidelines must incorporate certain energy efficiency standards established in law that are referred to as Sustainable Building 2030. Additionally, the guidelines must facilitate productivity improvements and create and maintain a healthy environment, among other requirements. So as you can see here on this slide, the current sustainable building guidelines are organized into 5 different categories of sustainability, such as energy and atmosphere and indoor environmental quality. You can find additional information about each of these categories in Exhibit 1.1 of our report on page 5. So each of these categories include several different guidelines with numerous requirements. For example, the energy and atmosphere category, which we've highlighted on this slide, includes 5 different guidelines pertaining to energy efficiency, renewable energy, and others. Most of these guidelines include multiple requirements. For example, the guideline pertaining to atmospheric protection, which you can see here as E.4, includes 2 broad requirements, one pertaining to using acceptable refrigerants, and the other pertaining to reducing refrigerant leakage. Overall, projects adhering to the Sustainable Building Guidelines may need to meet up to 90 individual requirements depending on the ultimate scope of the project. So you may be wondering who is involved in developing, implementing, and overseeing the Sustainable Building Guidelines. By law, there are 2 key agencies involved with the guidelines. Statutes require the Departments of Administration and Commerce to develop the Sustainable Building Guidelines with the assistance of other agencies. Statutes also require the Departments of Administration and Commerce to periodically review and revise the guidelines. In practice, the Department of Administration's purview has been over the guidelines sort of overall, whereas the Department of Commerce has really focused in more on that Sustainable Building 2030 component I mentioned, which is that energy and carbon reduction part of the guidelines. So in addition to the Departments of Administration and Commerce, I should note there are 2 other key groups that play really important roles with regard to the guidelines. So I mentioned on the last slide that admin and commerce are responsible for developing the guidelines. However, they have contracted with the Center for Sustainable Building Research at the University of Minnesota to primarily assume responsibility for administering the Sustainable Building Guidelines. Both the departments contract for a wide variety of services, including updating and managing the guidelines, providing education and technical assistance with regard to the guidelines, and more. The third key group that I want to mention here today is the project team. So project team members, such as agency contacts, guideline leaders, and many more people, play an integral role in implementing the guidelines on a project-by-project basis. So these project teams include numerous individuals, some from the public sector, such as state agency staff or local government staff, as well as people working in the private sector, such as employees of architectural firms or energy modelers. These individuals coordinate the completion of the guideline requirements on specific projects. They provide information about the project's overall efforts to follow the guidelines and more. So overall, when you think of these project team members, they're the folks who are responsible for the various aspects of the design, the construction, and then ultimately the operations of a particular building project. So with that to set the stage, I'd like to dive into the first key issue we found, that of a lack of clarity around roles and responsibilities for the program. We found that there was widespread disagreement and confusion about the roles and responsibilities regarding the Sustainable Building Guidelines. And today I'd like to talk about 2 levels, if you will, where we found a lack of clarity. First, there's a lack of clarity at the programmatic level regarding expectations for how the program should be administered and overseen. Second, there's a lack of clarity amongst the project team members about the Sustainable Building Guidelines and sort of how they work at the individual project level. So let's first take a look at the lack of clarity pertaining to the roles and responsibilities at the programmatic level. As I mentioned earlier, statutes require the Departments of Administration and Commerce to develop the Sustainable Building Guidelines. And although state law identifies these agencies responsible for developing the guidelines, statutes do not assign any sort of agency responsibility for administering or overseeing the guidelines after they are created. For example, statutes don't task a state agency with identifying which projects are subject to the guidelines, or they don't task an agency with monitoring or enforcing compliance with the guidelines, or even evaluating sort of the outcomes of the guidelines overall. We also found there's a lack of clarity at the project level with regard to the roles and responsibilities of project team members. Statutes do not define the role of project team members in implementing the sustainable building guidelines. So they don't, for instance, describe what role agency or local government staff play in ensuring that projects are complying with the guidelines. I'll note the guidelines themselves also do not define the majority of project roles for the team members that are working on this program. Many project team members that we interviewed told us that that expectations were not clear with regard how to fill their roles, and also that they had not received generally adequate training with regard to how to fulfill those roles. So the disagreement and confusion about roles and responsibilities regarding the sustainable building guidelines has really, unfortunately, ultimately led to a program that lacks adequate oversight and accountability. For instance, we found that sometimes there were agency staff or project team members who assumed that certain other people were taking important actions regarding the guidelines that they were not, which then really led us to question whether or not those activities were happening at all. So we provide several additional examples of this in the report, but I'll highlight one key example of this now. One of the key questions we were asked to take a look at as part of this evaluation was who is responsible for enforcing the sustainable building guidelines. As you can see on this slide, we surveyed project team members who had worked on recent projects subject to the guidelines and asked those project team members who, in their opinion, was responsible for ensuring that projects adhered to the guidelines. The responses we received from project team members varied widely, as you can see here on this slide. Nearly a quarter of the people who responded said they did not know who was responsible for ensuring that projects adhered to the sustainable building guidelines. And the remaining responses varied quite a lot, from various project team members like the owner or the guideline leader to the Center for Sustainable Building Research or the Department of Administration and others. So based on these conversations that we had with agency staff and project team members, as well as this survey, it really is unclear to us who, if anyone, is actually ensuring that projects comply with the guidelines. So we think that the lack of clarity in law with regard to the roles and responsibilities is really a critical issue, both with regard to what entity is supposed to administer and oversee the guidelines, as well as what the legislature ultimately expects that agency to do. So, for example, does the legislature expect that a certain agency would track whether or not projects are complying with the guidelines? And if those projects aren't complying with the guidelines, does the legislature expect that agency to take additional actions, for example, to ensure that projects are complying with the guidelines? We recommend that the legislature determine which agency should be responsible for the overall administration and oversight of the sustainable building guidelines, and then codify in law what that agency's responsibilities are. Once the legislature determines the agency is responsible for the program's administration and oversight, that agency should then work to clarify the roles and responsibilities of project team members and ensure that those project team members have adequate training to fulfill those responsibilities. One of the other key questions we were asked to determine as part of this evaluation was how often projects complied with the sustainable building guidelines. And unfortunately, significant issues with program data prevented us from answering this question. We discuss a number of these issues further in the report, but I'll highlight two issues here. First, it was not clear whether all projects that are required to adhere to the sustainable building guidelines are actually tracking their progress in meeting those guidelines. An example of that, we reviewed all of the projects in the 2020 bonding bill to see if they were tracking their compliance with the guidelines. Of the nearly 100 projects that we found in that bonding bill that could be subject to the guidelines, nearly 60 of those projects were not tracking their compliance with the guidelines in the program's database. It's possible, I should note, that some of these projects, those 100 projects I mentioned, were not actually subject to the guidelines, but as Ms. Randall mentioned earlier, we weren't able to find any sort of agency that has any sort of comprehensive list of the projects that are actually subject to the sustainable building guidelines. And so it wasn't possible for us to determine really how prevalent this issue truly was. But nonetheless, it isn't possible to assess the extent to which projects are complying with the guidelines if those projects aren't even tracking their compliance in the first place. Additionally, there were significant challenges due to a lack of up-to-date data on projects subject to the guidelines. According to a 2022 report from the Center for Sustainable Building Research, 67% of projects had not submitted up-to-date data that are required during the design and construction phases of a project. And for projects for which construction was complete, almost all of the projects had not submitted data that were required in a timely manner. Although these data are necessary to determine whether or not projects are complying with the guidelines, I should note that the legislature has not granted any agency authority to require projects to submit those data, which is another issue we discuss further in the report. So given that statutes currently dictate that the guidelines are required for certain capital projects, we think it's important to know whether or not all of those projects that are subject to the guidelines are following the requirements, are meeting the law. However, unfortunately, it's not possible to determine currently whether or not that's the case. We recommend that the legislature direct the agency it tasks with administering and overseeing the sustainable building guidelines to monitor project compliance with the guidelines. The legislature should also amend statutes to ensure that the state can successfully collect the data it needs in order to determine compliance in the first place. Once the legislature determines which agency it would like to administer and oversee the guidelines, that agency should then ensure that all project teams track their compliance with the guidelines. So next, I'd like to talk briefly about program goals. Overall, we think this is a program that would really benefit from some greater clarity around what the guidelines, what the program is supposed to achieve. Statutes currently state that the primary objectives of the Sustainable Building Guidelines are to ensure that all new state buildings and major renovations initially exceed the state energy code as established in Minnesota rules by at least 30%. However, that referenced chapter in Minnesota rules was repealed in 2009. So in other words, the primary objectives of this program as established in law have been obsolete for over 10 years at this point. Additionally, generally neither the legislature nor any state agency has established measurable program goals for the Sustainable Building Guidelines. As I mentioned at the outset of this presentation, the guidelines currently span 5 different sort of sustainability areas, from indoor environmental quality to energy in the atmosphere and more. Yet the only measurable goals pertaining to those guidelines are established in law for Sustainable Building 2030. That's the energy and atmosphere aspects of the guidelines. There aren't measurable goals for any of the other sustainability areas that the guidelines address. So we recommend that the legislature revise statutes to remove the reference to the repealed rules and update the description of the guidelines' primary objective. In doing so, we suggest that the legislature consider what it is really that it wants the guidelines to accomplish and then make that clear in law. We also recommend that the legislature direct the agency it tasks with administering and overseeing the guidelines to establish measurable goals for the guidelines. It's difficult to determine whether the Sustainable Building Guidelines are meeting their intended purpose without first establishing some specific performance goals for the program. So in establishing these goals, we suggest that the agency should work to ensure that the goals better represent the current breadth of the guidelines, while also then considering the primary objectives established for the program by the legislature. Finally, I'd like to talk about how this program has impacted projects subject to the Sustainable Building Guidelines overall. We received several questions about how the Sustainable Building Guidelines have affected the cost of bond-funded buildings, as well as how the guidelines have affected the sustainability of the buildings. So for example, whether or not the buildings subject to this requirement are now more energy efficient or are using less water, for example. Unfortunately, the overall effect of the program on building costs and sustainability is unknown. Currently, neither the state nor the Center for Sustainable Building Research systematically collects or analyzes data on project cost. And while the program has some data on the sustainability of buildings that are subject to these guidelines, most of those data are actually estimates rather than actual program outcomes. Both staff at the Department of Administration and the Center for Sustainable Building Research has commented to us that collecting data on building performance and project cost has not been a priority. So in conclusion, we think that the questions we received about the impact the guidelines have had on state-funded projects, both with regard to cost as in addition to the regard to with sustainability, really are fair questions to ask. However, unfortunately, it's not currently possible to determine what effect the guidelines have had. So we do recommend that the legislature direct the agency it tasks with administering and overseeing the sustainable building guidelines to systematically evaluate the effect of the building guidelines in both of those areas, both cost and sustainability. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll conclude my formal remarks, and I'm happy to stand for questions or can step aside for the agencies, whatever you would prefer.
Thank you, Ms. Badger. Why don't we turn it over to the agencies and then we'll go with members' questions. First up, we have Director Wazlowski from the Department of Administration. And then after that, we'll have Director Kelly from Commerce and Director Graves from the Center for Sustainable Building Research. Welcome. Please identify yourself and proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. For the record, my name is Wayne Wazlowski. I'm Assistant Commissioner with the Department of Administration. Admin appreciated the opportunity to work with the Office of the Legislative Auditor throughout the performance evaluation to identify ways to improve compliance with the Minnesota Sustainable Building Guidelines. Admin submitted a written response to each of the key findings in the audit, and you see those in the audit report. While the scope of the audit did not evaluate effectiveness of individual sustainability guidelines, we would like to acknowledge that sustainability measures implemented, including meeting SB 2030 energy performance standards, have had a direct impact on reducing energy consumption and greenhouse gas across a wide spectrum of state-funded projects. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. We look forward to further discussions on ways to improve compliance with guidelines, and happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you. Director Kelly, welcome. Please identify yourself and proceed.
Good afternoon, Chair and members. For the record, my name is John Kelly. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the Minnesota Department of Commerce. The department is committed to making improvements to the program. We feel it has been successful, but it does need some adjustments as characterized in the report. We appreciate the thorough review and report by the OLA and the good working relationship we established during this report. So thank you to the OLA and the staff at the OLA. B3 is a cross-agency program with interagency agreement that allows funding to flow to the Department of Administration and the Center for Sustainable Building Research to implement the aspects of the program. We review routine reporting and to verify that each entity has met the requirements of their respective contracts. Commerce does not currently have the authority to expend funding appropriated for the purpose of B3 on staffing or administrative support. However, the department is open to exploring options for adequately staffing for oversight of this program. With adequate resources and clarification of program oversight and authority through legislative remedy, Commerce is supportive of implementing solutions identified by staff that were reflected in the findings of the OLA report, including, but not limited to, agencies and projects not budgeting for B3 compliance, but studying by what's working and what's not working on the platform, with increasing outreach and partnership with the Department of Administration and the Center for Sustainable Building Research, increasing participation by other state agencies, communicating how B3 supports achievement of climate action framework and other state goals, demonstrating first costs versus operating costs to demonstrate the ability for long-term economic benefits of the program, and to inform entities of relevant utility programs that could lessen upfront costs. Commerce also would recommend the authority for incentives, disincentives for compliance. For poor, and an example would be maybe a fee for poor documentation submission. The department appreciates the committee's attention to this matter and looks forward to helping develop next steps and potential legislative solutions that address the OLA's findings. The outcomes of the B3 program and subsequent SB 2030 performance standards are critical to achieving goals of Minnesota's climate action framework, including the use of clean energy and implementation of efficiency in our built environment. We look forward to making sure that the efforts of B3 make meaningful contributions to these goals. And I'll thank you for the time, and I'll note that I'm joined here by my colleague, Jack Klumke, from the Department's Energy Division, in case there are more in-depth program questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Director Kelly. Next up, we have Dr. Graves from the Center for Sustainable Building Research at the University of Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I am Professor Richard Graves, Director of the Center for Sustainable Building Research at the University of Minnesota. And as mentioned in the report, the center oversees and develops the guidelines and works with project teams for their compliance in the B3 program. Our response to the report is outlined at the end of the report in our letter. And just to hit a couple of the highlights in that response, the staff appreciates the report and the review of the program and the desire for clarity and accountability to align the processes to achieve the legislature's goals for sustainability in state-funded capital construction. As we report to the legislature quarterly, the SB 2030 portion of the guidelines saves the state over $6.7 million in operating costs every year, and has saved almost $83.5 million to date in the projects that we track. In addition, work on sustainable projects in the B3 program builds the capacity of the design, construction, and operations industries to improve the quality of the built environment for all construction in Minnesota, not just the capital construction projects, and that's one of the real benefits of the program. We at the center look forward to working with the legislature and the departments on improving the guidelines and project compliance in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Graves. Members, that ends the testimony from the agencies involved. So now we'll turn it over to members' questions. Representative Erdahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And apparently, this Sustainable Building Guidelines passed in 2001, even before I got to the legislature, by 1 year. But it's unfortunate, and I do appreciate this report, appreciate the work of the OLA, but it's unfortunate that apparently we're not keeping up with the accountability. We don't know what's happening with these guidelines, how they are being implemented. And I'm wondering, Mr. Chair, what is who should be doing the regulations, the statute, to make sure that there is some accountability, to put some order to doing this? We have a committee on sustainable infrastructure. I'm wondering if there's anyone from that committee here that is aware of any legislation going on. Should they be doing this? Should the Capital Investment Committee be holding folks accountable?
Thank you, Representative Erdahl. And, you know, I was the one that submitted this evaluation for the Office of the Legislative Auditor, and I think that we have a responsibility as the Capital Investment Committee for projects that are within our jurisdiction, whether that's GO funded or general fund funded, and whether that's through our committee, through the Sustainable Building, Sustainability Infrastructure Committee, or even state government with the oversight of Department of Administration, MMB, and now with Commerce here, whether that's through the Commerce Committee or Climate. I think we have different avenues, and that's for us to decide as a legislature which committee is best to move forward with some of these recommendations. Representative Erdahl.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think that's an important determination to be made, soon. Should these, where should this legislation be coming from? What committee should it be going through?
Sounds good, Representative Erdahl. And it seems like you might have some. Well, we'll have a discussion on whether we can move it in capital investment, because I think that my interest is to get this some clarity on some of the recommendations, and if we can move it through capital investment, I think that that's the best place for us. Representative Franson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so I think I asked kind of about this situation one of my bonding projects earlier in the year regarding the need for solar panels, if they wanted to continue with the bonding dollars that we had passed, last year, the year before? I can't keep up because we don't do bonding very often anymore. I know, but anyway, I digress. So that's where I learned about the B3. Also, what I have been learning since my time of being educated on the B3, which, by the way, I was like 24, just shy of being 24 years old when those recommendations were passed by the legislature, and I am no longer 24, if you can tell, so. To go back, though. Anyway, so what I have also learned during this time is that there are numerous small projects around the state that are being hampered by the B3. And so one in particular takes place in my district. It's the home base, if you will, Caring Hands Dental Clinic. And they work with the underinsured and uninsured population. And they have facilities across the state. And in 2018 or 2019, we passed a bonding bill that was to benefit Pipestone in that county. And unfortunately, the requirements were so cost prohibitive that it has stopped that project going. And I do know that Pipestone could utilize this dental clinic to help their population of people. And so it sounds just basic going here, listening to the comments that you've made and comments up here that we probably won't scrap it. I mean, I would prefer to eliminate this program. Should be no shock to anyone. But perhaps we can put in some waivers in place if, so that these smaller projects that are constrained by the costs of the requirements could still go forward. Also, I'd still like my bonding project in Alexandria to go through without solar panels.
Thank you, Representative Franson. And I think those are some very valuable and comments for us to consider as a committee. And I would say that I have a few proposals that's going to state gov that will be coming to us for us to have further discussion on how do we ensure that we have a capital budgeting process that helps not just, the communities that you're talking about, whether they're local units of government or a small nonprofit, so that they could actually understand the requirements that's needed of them. And as we have seen all the bill introduction, the almost 400 that has been sent to our committee, they're from local units of government or nonprofits. And so I think that's definitely a needed conversation for us to have as a body and as a state on some of these requirements, whether that's sustainable building guidelines or other requirements that are needed and are attached with some of our geo bonding dollars. Representative Scrabble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Being new to this and kind of grasping all this, I do have a degree in construction management, which I haven't used, but I still understand what's going on here. And could I get Dr. Graves to ask him a question? Is that okay?
Yep, Dr. Graves is coming, so please proceed with your question.
Yeah, okay, a couple of questions. I see, Dr. Graves, that you are AIA.
Dr. Graves.
Representative, yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Representative Scrabble.
So what I'm looking for, Mr. Chair, design is always the key to, once you design it, and then the engineers work through it, and then we find out if it works or if it doesn't. And then when it works, it's kind of like everyone says, hey, that's a great idea, I want to use that. And then everyone keeps using that process. And I understand in 2001, this was all kind of new, I won't say brand new, but how can we make it better? Mm-hmm. And after hearing the testimony of the Office of Legislative, the Legislative Auditor, kind of like no one's following the rules here. We're all kind of just doing our own thing, but it's working, kind of. But the legislature should put new rules to make sure who's going to do what. And your role in the Center for Sustainable Building Research and being an architect, and I read through here a little bit. Does it does the design process and the parameters that go with the design process, is that enough for the role to make sure it gets done right? Or do we really need another government agency to make sure that these get done right?
Dr. Graves.
Representative, I don't think it's in my expertise to answer the question if we need another agency, but I think one of the challenges is without there being kind of clear consequences to project teams, we do our best to well, the other thing I should say for some context, I became director of the Center for Sustainable Building Research in 2014. So the program started before me and was structured around sustainability programs that existed at that time. Part of the challenge that we have at the center is we create the guidelines, we update them. I think a real advantage of the program by having it be a Minnesota-based program is that we can meet with project teams and stakeholders to get their input on the guidelines and find out if there are issues with small projects. And so we actually started a small project guide for the small projects to try to streamline requirements, actually remove some requirements for small projects just because it's just easier. But the real challenge is without there being kind of consequences for them, we're sort of asking for compliance. We even have had for a few bonding sessions, had workshops that we offered for all the new bonded projects, and hardly any project teams take us up on it because most of the work happens just before they're in construction or even in construction as a, let's just report that as compliance. And then at that point, it's really too late to make changes, influence the design, and if we can do that earlier in pre-design or early design stages, that's the chance to make adjustments at minimum costs.
Representative Scraba.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's kind of what you know, the whole design process, to me, I'm jumping in this at the the end, so I don't quite understand the whole process, so what happens. But it just seems there's a lot of redundancy, and then not even knowing, does this work or doesn't it work? But it worked before, so it must be okay. And then we're spending money on something, and maybe it shouldn't even be used on this project or whatever, you know, and again, I'm speaking way off the end of my board right now, but it just seems like, after hearing the first testimony, the check and balance is gone, you know, and if it has to work, then you have to have some authority to do it. And if we're Mr. Chair, this is where I'm getting confused, but if we're the ones that are supposed to find the authority to make sure this works, where is your recommendation in here to solve that? Do you know, or? Mr. Chair?
Graves.
No, I did not make a recommendation on who should have the authority.
Okay, all right.
Representative Scraba.
Obviously, I need to do a lot of reading here, but I just think some of these projects, there's a lot of great ideas out there. There's a lot of companies doing a lot of good things to make sustainable, make things more efficient. And I think the ones that work stick, the ones that just to do it and not have anything in no outcome. Those are the ones that I think no one wants to do anymore, and that's why we're not having any compliance. So I could be wrong, but I'm in the construction industry still a little bit, and I see how it works. So I'm just hoping that we can find a solution to this, because, Mr. Chair, I agree there's a lot of money that's being spent here, and if we could use it to help other things, I would much rather do that than to try to keep something going that maybe shouldn't be going. But thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Scraba, and I'll be in touch with you then.
Good.
Representative Ryer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks to the office for the report. Ms. Badger, thanks for the walkthrough previously. It'll come as no surprise to anyone to hear me say that I do think that they are worth investing in, that now more than ever we need to be creating a built environment that's sustainable, that will lead us into the future, our kids and grandchildren. And this report has shown us that the process we have has many process flaws, has many opportunities for improvement coming right from the very start. Anyone who's spent time in organizations knows that when you have two people in charge of something, you have no one in charge of something. And I think that's what we're seeing here. I'm curious, and there might not be an answer, but whether or not admin had originally been in charge, and then when we had Sustainable Building 2030 come in, if that's when we added commerce, it doesn't really matter, I guess, for right now. But the point is, I think, sorting that out, and then so many things will follow. Knowing who's responsible, knowing what accountability looks like, knowing what types of information and training people need. There's quite a roadmap here for very classic organizational process improvement work, talking to the people who do the work and getting it sorted so that we can get the benefits. Because I was looking at information out at the university site and seeing case examples where the guidelines had been implemented and did make a difference in terms of energy efficiency, environmental impact, and quality of experience for the people who worked in the building. So I'm in favor of investing in these, but I don't think we should put it off. I think that if we want them to yield the results that we need, we should be investing. I also want to comment on your point, Representative Franzen, about small organizations. We used to see that a lot with great big sets of documents and reports that small medical clinics had to do about the things they were providing. And there's the same thing that like Park Nicollet would have to do, and it made no sense. You know, you have to have the scale of the intervention match the level of benefit and the organization that you're working with. So I think that's a really important piece. There's lots of work to do here. I think it's really good work. Thank you.
Representative Franson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So first, thank the OLA because they met with me a couple weeks ago. I'm sure they met with you too, Mr. Chair. So as we see on page 8 of the nice one here that's in color, the program goals, primary objectives and law obsolete, generally no measurable program goals. We go on to page 9, gives us some recommendations, of course, to say establish measurable goals, and then the outcomes. So after 22 years, this program, the outcomes are unknown, the cost is unknown, sustainability is unknown. So just a thought here, just work with me here, crazy idea. But perhaps we can put a little time out on these projects that are moving forward that are unable to do so because of cost reasons, you name it, until, I mean, if you keep the program, sounds like you probably will, until this is actually revamped. Because right now we're in like this black space, this black hole, right? Where it's the unknown. And we're hearing from the gentleman up there, was that Mr. Graves that was mentioning consequences, which I don't like that word, because it sounds kind of scary, right? So we're gonna punish the business if they don't meet the benchmarks after they've done their project. So I just think that there needs to be if you're gonna continue to actually have like a plan in place. But there's a lot of projects right now that are being held up because of the B3. And we do all this wonderful work in this committee on bonding, and we argue and fight, are we gonna have the votes to pass? And we finally magically do get the votes to pass, it's magic these days. And then some of these projects that we work so hard for are unable to get done. I mean, thoughts?
Representative Fred said I'll answer that, and I think Representative Ryer has some comments on this. And I think this ties back to what Representative Scraba said around the design and trying to get a better grasp of this whole situation too, where a lot of, projects that we're seeing, the 390 or so that has been submitted, we I don't know if you all know, but I don't know where they are at in the process of design. They're asking for pre-design, design, engineering, construction. And so are these projects that are really coming to us ready to go so that, maybe if they have the conversation and they are ready to go, that they have already considered the B3 program or not. And I think, for us as the legislature and, for me as chair, when we're meeting with these individual projects from across the entire state, we're asking them these questions. Are you working with somebody who's a qualified, cost estimating professional to make sure that your project cost is accurate? And I think that to your point about projects coming to us and we're thinking about funding them, but because of these issues, if we were able to identify this on the front end and you actually come to the legislature with an accurate number for your project, I think that we should fully fund that number, whether that's more or less than what you have submitted because you did not go through the process of actually doing the pre-design and design work. And that's just, kind of hitting on Representative Scraba's point. And so I hope that as we move forward, whether we waive this or not, that projects actually do some work on the front end to understand the responsibility that they have or will need if they are looking for state GO dollars or general fund dollars. Representative Franzen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was hoping to find the email that I had regarding the project in my district, the Runestone, because something changed. So when they first went ahead with the project, they were never told about the B3. And then it was after they got the bonding dollars, that is when the project management team said, hey, there's these requirements, which they had just found out about it. So that's what I'm thinking is there's definitely was some sort of, something happened where didn't seem to be a problem before with these projects being able to move forward, and then something happened, something snapped, and then all of a sudden like, oh.
So Representative Franzen, I feel for that situation. I think this is where, if that project that you're talking about specifically wants to come back and ask for the additional dollars because of this requirement, I think that's a case-by-case basis that we could have this conversation. And, for me as the chair, I would think that as we move forward, I just want to put it out there for the public right now that I would like to see that we have the B3 requirements, the sustainability requirements for both the GO and the general fund bill that we're moving forward. And one of the issues that Representative Erdahl raised, prevailing wage, that we have this and we make it public and now so that everybody throughout the state know that these are the requirements that I as chair would like us to consider so that when people are coming for us, they can give us an accurate number that accounts for those items so that we don't have to fund something and then have them come back and ask for more funding, more dollars because we did not give them the right amount the first time. Representative Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to talk about consequences for a minute. And to me, the place where I would be starting with consequences is with the people who are overseeing the project. That's the first place, and not just want to tell the agencies I'm not coming at you with a big stick, just don't panic or anything. But we aren't equipping, we aren't saying, here's who's responsible for what, here are the resources to do it, here's the people, here's what all the roles and responsibilities are. We can't hold projects accountable for that. We can't hold agencies accountable for that until we tell them what should be done and make it possible. But I think that that's where we get some leverage is when we say, we are going to go out and gather the information. We are going to go out and we're going to have clear objectives that we're going to be able to measure. And we're going to own as a state gathering that data and looking at it rather than putting it on people whose expertise is building things. Most of them aren't researchers. The more useful job maybe. But I think that that's where accountability comes in, and then we can enable the projects with proactive, here's the training you need. As Chair Lee was saying, here's the information you need to have. Here's how we do it so that we do get a carrot going to the projects. And ideally, and I think from what the data, some data, project by project data is, they will see benefits in terms of environmental impact and savings and all of the other good things. Thanks.
1 second, Representative Franson, see if we have any other questions. Representative Franson.
Okay, so, Mr. Chair, thank you. And so we've had this program in place for 22 years. It must be so cumbersome that the legislative law, the intent of the law, is unable to be followed. So, the legislature passed the law. It's not being followed because of everything you've read in here. So maybe we just scrap it. I mean, I don't think we need to add more layers to the program to make sure it's being followed. Maybe we scrap it and then just start over. I just, it's not the fault of individuals that are not following this. It's just because it's so cumbersome. Not that they don't want to, and some of them are like, probably just like, it's so cost prohibitive.
Thank you for that, Representative Franson, and
I'm on team scrap the B3.
appreciate knowing that. I know that Representative Ryer will be taking the lead on looking at some of these recommendations and drafting legislation so that we could have further discussion on this. Representative Scrabba.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Ryer, I think there's room between where you are, where Representative Franson is. And I feel like what you were saying, it kind of, my mind started going and I'm like, they're the bare minimums. You know, here's a minimum you must meet and exceed. So the design parameters are, here's what you have to do this is what we expect from this project. And then if the engineers and the architects come in and say, hey, we're finding new ways to do this, it's like, okay, we'll look at this and accept it or not. Because I think at least I want us to grow. I want us to find new materials that are lighter, cheaper, and more effective in doing the sustainable part of these projects. Instead of, because I could go back to 2001 and there's a lot of things we don't do anymore like that. And that was all part of the standards. They're just not on the books anymore. And the new stuff that's out there. Now you have to keep track of all those things. Who keeps track of them? And if the buildings, benchmarks and beyond, the building and benchmarks are normal, the beyond is the part I think where this is missed. You know, I mean, the benchmarks are here, this is here. And yes, I think it should have some oversight so that these things get done. Where it comes from, you're right. How did it go from one agency to another agency? And what is the enforcement? You know, is it a punishment that you don't get to bid on it or do? Who knows what it is? I don't know what it is, but I think there's 21 or 20 some years of this to walk away from it completely might be harder than easier. It's just my thoughts right now. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Scrabba. Members, any additional questions or comments? Seeing none, I would just want to say thank you to the Office of the Legislative Auditors, Department of Commerce, Administration, and Dr. Graves for being here to provide your perspective on this. Members, our next meeting is on Wednesday, March 1st. On the agenda are 16 bills that are drinking and wastewater related infrastructure bonding requests. These bills will be allocated 5 minutes and heard on an informational basis only, as is the custom for all the bills that are coming through our committee. And with that, members, this meeting is adjourned.